Okay, all right. Thank you, Dr. Rai, for reminding. Okay, everyone, welcome. I think on behalf of Prof. Ruzi, I'm just grateful that all of you are still here. This is our fifth hour. I think we've been here for 4 hours. So yeah, so thank you very much for still being interested. So yeah, join me in welcoming Dr. Shivani, a very renowned author. So let me just do a bit of introduction, Dr. Shivani, and yes, all right. So yeah, so Dr. Shivani has been writing and publishing fiction and poetry for over 20 years. So her first book, Wildlife on Coal Island, was published by UPM Press in 2011 and republished by HarperCollins India. And then she also had her second book published, Yalpanam, published by Penguin Southeast Asia, I think about last year, 1 year ago. And she has also been writing lots of short stories, lots of poems that have been published all over the world. And then, yes, I think you have a recent collection, Being Born. And yeah, and then of course, novellas and whatnot. So you have also been teaching, Dr. Shivani. Your academic research focuses on creative writing, pedagogy, and ecological literature. So you are currently teaching English literature and creative writing at the University of Nottingham, and you are already working on your next novel. No wonder people are asking, where do you find the time? Wonderful, Dr. Shivani. So yes, allow me to share screen. Okay, so you just let me know when you want me to move to the next slides. Okay. All right.
Perfect.
Uh, All right.
Just
Okay, over to you, Dr. Shivani.
hold on.
Okay, don't worry.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Ruby, for that introduction. So it's pretty clear that in today's talk, I'll be speaking as a creative writer, specifically a fiction writer. I've published 4 books so far, a collection of short stories that Ruby's mentioned, a novel, a collection of 2 novellas, and a poetry collection. And so the title of my talk today is Place-Based Writing, National Narratives and Ecological Orientations. It's quite a mouthful. All the key components of my presentation today are embedded in those words. And they also represent the essence of my output as a creative writer. Place, the voicing of stories within the Malaysian nation space and landscape, as well as topics of the natural world and environmental concerns are at the heart of my work. And I would argue that part of the repertoire is also of interest, of course, to many Malaysian writers in English, particularly around issues of place, displacement, the building of narratives within the Malaysian context. The environmental dimension is not as pronounced and concrete, although there are nature-based themes in a few works, like the poems of Muhammad Haji Saleh, even Shirley Lim's latest poetry collection in Praise of Limes, and in Tan Tuan Ding's novels, particularly The Garden of Evening Mists. But there isn't yet, I think, a sustained output and discourse around literature and ecology in the local context. So today I will talk about place-based writing with regards to my creative output from a couple of perspectives. First of all, from an idea of national narratives as being constituted of local place-specific stories, and secondly, briefly from an ecological perspective. So as I track my journey, as a writer and reflect on the writing of my novel Yalpanam and my novel In Progress, I see that the topics of place, displacement, belonging, and land are recurrent in an almost obsessive way. And these are topics that are important preoccupations for writers like me, whose recent familial history, involved migration, acculturation, displacement, replacement, and whose national past involved decolonization, colonization, and endeavors to carve out a national identity. And like many writers in marginalized and specifically diasporic positions, both in Malaysia and elsewhere, our imagining of national spaces and narratives necessarily includes, the lost voices, the migrational voices. I think it's also important to note that even though many boundaries are being blurred, these days due to our virtual lives, where belonging and identity, they traverse a range of areas, that can at least momentarily transcend these geographical and national borders. I have come to the conclusion that we are, at the end of the day, embodied creatures, with cultural and ethnic inheritances that are tied to physical spaces and lived experiences in a three-dimensional world. So the global is present and important, yes, but so is the local. Can we change the slide, please? Thanks. So when I teach, creative writing at the University of Nottingham, I highlight place-based writing in my classes that's cautious about bypassing the local for the global, or transnational. So I incorporate, for example, the thinking of Eric Ball and Alicia Lai, which is on when they argue that, and the quote is there on the screen, that an educational system that privileges transnational agenda ignores and does actual harm to local areas and encourages displacement, thus weakening local communities. Slide change, please. Okay, so what exactly do I mean when I talk about place-based writing? So in a nutshell, it's not far off from Ball and Lai's emphasis on local communities and places, which in my writing translates into a specific fictional island called Coal Island that's based on my hometown, Port Dickson. And that specific micro place is inevitably linked, in some way to the larger national space, which is Malaysia. So I see place-based writing as revealing the diverse stories of people in particular specific places like towns and islands and particular communities within larger spaces like the nation, with the emphasis and starting point being the setting. So in other words, it's the location itself that provides material and inspiration during the writing process. And the emphasis here is on bringing to the surface these varied and often unheard stories in smaller local spaces that in turn, weave the fabric of a complex national narrative. And so one of the central questions that plays in a subconscious way while I'm writing is, what makes a place a place? And through the process of writing, I've discovered that it's many things, of course, including stories and histories of the people, the ghosts of the dead, histories and stories from lands left, and of course the physical sensuous details of the literal land itself. And the other question that arises is, and how does a person inhabit a place? Which is usually what my stories are then attempting to answer. Okay, so how did I get to this point, as a writer, of prioritizing local settings and of paying attention to the many stories that exist, in the nooks and corners of the larger national fabric? Slide change, please. So I'd say that the books I've read and the ideas I've been exposed to have shaped the way I write about place. So a good way for me to continue to answer this question of what place-based writing is in relation to my creative process is to backtrack to my days of postgraduate research, because it has been a big influence on my thinking about topics such as place, nation, identity, which has then molded my imagination and creative output. So when I was doing my MA and PhD at Warwick, I spent most of my time reading literature from the Caribbean and Malaysia by writers such as B.S. Naipaul, Sam Selvin, yes, Maniam Lloyd Ferrando. And what struck me was how place heavy, a lot of the texts were, and how the settings in some of these stories became characters in themselves. And these were, these places were peopled by a diverse range of characters. So I drew inspiration from books like A House for Mr. Biswas, in which ownership and habitation of a house was a matter of urgency and, even emergency. His Miguel Street, which would then go on to inspire the writing of my first book, conveyed how the fictional Trinidadian street was as much a character as the people who lived on it. And I also found similar themes, in the books of K.S. Maniam. In a Far Country is really, an anxious meditation on what it means to inhabit the land. And so is Between Lives, actually, and how one becomes a part of the country. So these books and themes, spoke to me in a deep way, because my experiences, both personal and familial, were reflected in these stories. And these observations would eventually find their way into the writing of my first book, Wildlife on Coal Island, which is a collection of short stories that presents the stories and lives of multicultural Malaysian characters on this tiny island called Coal Island. So you can see the front cover of the book on the screen. The island is fictional, but it's based on my hometown, Port Dickson, as I mentioned earlier, and it's become the setting for all my stories. So the island is a character itself, and it is what it is due to many factors, including the diverse range of people who live on it, as well as its unique physical features. And the stories in this collection are full of voices of the marginalized, the unheard, the silenced. And I found it necessary to have these voices be included as part of the cacophony of Malaysian narratives. Slide change. Okay, so you could say that these stories that I read not only inspired me and affirmed my reality, but they also empowered me to write my own stories. The question that has become more and more important for me, and which I also ask my students, is who will write about the places that we inhabit, if not for us? And also, of course, there is a great danger in presenting any singular national narrative. Instead, there are national narratives, plural. They're made up of a range of stories within diverse locations, within that larger nation space. So what's become very clear to me is that it's still a matter of importance, for contemporary Malaysian and post-colonial writers to insist on writing our stories in places that are specific to us. And although decolonial narratives were actively sought for by writers of earlier generations, we still need to continue this insistence. I say this also because I teach the new generation of writers who do need to be reminded of where they come from and to tell their stories. And arguably, of course, the nature of this insistence has changed, to include notions, for example, of digital identities and also environmental concerns. But I think that there's still many more stories that haven't been excavated yet and that are tied to the complexities of how we inhabit, or in fact, don't inhabit certain places. And this is, basically what fuels my writing. Slide change, please. Okay, so it's not accidental that my first two books have the names of places in them, Coal Island in the first book and Yalpanam in the second, and both are, of course, set on Coal Island. So Yalpanam is the Tamil word for Jaffna in Sri Lanka, which is where the protagonist, Pushpanayagi, who you see on the front cover of the book, where she comes from, and which is also where my grandparents migrated from to Malaya in the early 20th century. The Yalpanam on the novel, however, primarily relates to the house inhabited by Pushpanayagi, which she's named Yalpanam, as a means to memorialize, the place she's left behind, but which remains in her and with her, in unnameable ways. Just to give you some context, if you haven't read the novel, so in essence, the novel is about reclaiming the past in order to live out the present more fully and to envisage a more expansive, inclusive future. And there are two central characters, one of whom is a 185-year-old recluse, that's Pushpanayagi, and the other central character is her much, much, much younger neighbor, 18-year-old Maxim Chia, who is, upset at home. She's searching for answers about her life, specifically about her place, in the world, in the country, on the island, in her family, since she feels emotionally, psychologically, spiritually disconnected from the land of her birth. And so she finds her way to Yalpanam, the old lady's house, and they begin an unlikely friendship. So Yalpanam here is symbolic of the quest for belonging, which involves sending Pushpanayagi back to 19th century and 1940s Malaya, where she has to recover stories from her past that have been buried by time and her own avoidance. So yeah, I wrote Yalpanam to explore the multiple meanings, of home, diasporic identity, as well as Malaysian identity, and what it means to belong to a land, a culture, a country, but also as a human being. So ultimately, each of the characters is searching for acceptance, a place to be, and a big part of this process involves discovering their connection to the land through history, through untold stories, through explorations of family secrets. In fact, landing somewhere, finding meaning, identity, belonging somewhere has always been a preoccupation in my writing. I think coming from an immigrant family, we're automatically very place conscious. As I mentioned earlier, my grandparents left Sri Lanka in the early 20th century and made a home in Malaya. But as a minority, immigrant community, adjustments and assimilation in the new context is always complex. And there's often a lot of anxiety, around the place left and adjusting and inhabiting the new place. And there's also, of course, the perpetual haunting, in cultural memory of the place left, even down the generational line. For example, I've never personally experienced dislocation, but the pain of it is there in my family and community. And so it becomes a kind of obsession. So my book that's just been released, a collection of 2 novellas called What Has Happened to Harry Pillay, which you see the front cover on the screen, also has this theme of attempting to land. The title novella deals with a Sri Lankan Tamil family that hasn't been able to acculturate, in the Malaysian context. Okay, slide change, please. Okay, so ultimately, I find myself, as a writer, pursuing these narratives of belonging within local settings. In Yalpanam, the narratives of belonging and non-belonging are very much rooted in the physical and natural spaces of the land, in the historical narratives of the country, and also in the ghostly narratives of places left behind, but that never truly expire. So what does it take to pursue these narratives of belonging? It took me 10 years, actually, to complete this novel. And most people who ask why it took so long often assume that it's because of the amount of research I had to do. I did do a range of research for the novel, particularly for the historical portions of the story in the 19th century and 1940s Malaya. And I relied on the Selangor Journal to give me an idea of the activities, news, the day-to-day lives of the colonials in 19th and 20th centuries, in the 19th and 20th centuries in British Malaya. I also visited museums, in Lukud and Kuala Selangor to look at artifacts, particularly cutlery and domestic objects, so that I could get a visceral sense of my historical setting. And of course, reading books on British colonization and the Japanese occupation, helped to envisage that period of Malaysian history. And this type of research is, necessary because it gives me a substantial and believable picture of the places of the past. But I would say that ultimately it wasn't the research that took so much time. It was more the need to mature into an understanding of belonging that took time. And this required growth on my part on several levels, psychological, emotional, spiritual. And I had to face my own, discomfort of non-belonging, and the search to land somewhere. And finally, pursuing these narratives of belonging that are located within micro settings such as Coal Island, that exist within macro settings like Malaysia, they require me to be alert to diversity. The Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie, many years ago, she warned us about the danger of the single story. And I think this very much still applies to writers today, particularly to writers in multicultural spaces like Malaysia. And I think that even though it has been several decades since independence, and although the earlier generation of Malaysian writers has already tackled, notions of national identity and decolonization, displacement, identity politics, I think there's still many areas and nuances of these topics that haven't been explored. And as a writer, I keep going back to these concerns, specifically to find these untold stories from unheard voices in order to diversify and expand the fabric of our narratives. Slide change, please. And so, yeah, this brings me to an interesting point in my trajectory as a writer, because in the process of doing this, I have found definitely extensions and a deepening of these narratives of belonging, setting, and becoming a part of a place. And this has become more pronounced in the latest novel that I'm writing, which is requiring me to do research on geology, environmental issues, and on the ecological health of the very setting of my story. So I have a protagonist who is attempting to find answers to who he is, having left his native Malaysia to live in the UK. And this process entails not just a questioning of national, cultural, ethnic loyalties, but also the physical landscapes of each country. I can't say very much more about this novel because it hasn't been written yet, and it's still a work in progress. In any case, I think in today's world, in today's climate, I'm finding it more and more impossible to investigate things like place, space, belonging, non-belonging, without also considering environmental issues, and to take note of ecological concerns that inevitably factor into notions of who we are and where we're going in our particular locations. And for a place-oriented writer such as myself, it becomes hard not to include issues of environmental dimensions in my writing. And I found that the more I looked at the local landscape of my novel setting, the more it became evident that when we talk about topics like identity and belonging and location, we also have to talk about these topics as a species, and in a world that's threatened by environmental destruction. So I think what place means today necessarily involves environment and the natural world. And while the first, second generation anti-colonial, post-colonial writers, they focus their attention on belonging and freedom and identity in terms of the specifically national, social, and cultural, I think the nature of these explorations is changing, or can change anyway, due to the environmental crisis we're facing. So I'm with Amitav Ghosh here when he asks the question of the place of the non-human in the modern novel, as well as the position of the collective, especially in today's Anthropocene age, which is named as such because of human involvement, in geological processes. And Ghosh writes in his incredible essay, which I recommend, by the way, it's a beautifully written essay called Uncanny and Improbable Events. And he writes here that it was exactly in the Anthropocene in which, and the quote is on the screen here, human activity was changing the Earth's atmosphere, that the literary imagination became radically centered on the human. And also the turn away from the communal and the collective in the modern novel, which tends to be the domain of the individual, he claims in this essay, has not helped in the using of the modern novel to tell the story of environmental crisis. In terms of how this applies to the novel I'm writing, I don't know yet. I'm still in the process of figuring this out. What I do know is that the research for the novel is taking me into new territories, such as geology and ecology, and is pushing me to consider new, deeper meanings of place, which both includes the national, the communal, and the local, and brings in the natural world and environmental concerns in a conscious and more pronounced way. Okay, I will end here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shivani. That was very engaging. I was engrossed throughout the whole thing. All right. Okay. If any of you have questions, please raise up your hand, because I think it's better if you ask directly. Okay. But before that, I also have a question, Dr. Shivani, because you mentioned place, and I've been exploring a lot of that. In post-colonial literature, I think you cannot escape the notion of place and people. However, if I would like to contextualize my background and where I come from, I wonder how much of this sentiment of, how usually people say, oh, ini tanah Melayu, ini tanah kita. And then there's always this tension, we must stay here because we only have this country for our people.
Yes.
And then this is not your country. So there is always that existence that is imbued, for example, if you were born in a majority group versus the marginalized group. So I wonder, this sentiment that I find quite unique to Malaysia, how much of that sentiment about place
Yeah.
informs your writing? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's because there's the danger, I think, when we emphasize place and the local, that then becomes very territorial, and it becomes, tribalism at its worst. I think then that's why I emphasize diversity. When we talk about place, it's never one story. If you investigate a place really closely in all its minutiae, right, you'll find that actually there are not just many voices, but also many existences. That's why when we start to include the non-human, which is why I said, as we're moving into a more extended or deepened sense of what place means, we'll start to see that actually there is more multiplicity, there's more plurality than there is a heterogeneous understanding of a place. I think we need to move beyond a theoretical understanding of what place is. So there's we spin a narrative, right? Like this is who we are one Malaysia, and that becomes this sort of empty slogan, empty sloganism. I just, that's not a term, but I rather like it. I think perhaps I invented it for now.
Yes, you can theorize it. You can theorize it.
Empty sloganism, which is why I say it's a continuous process of bringing out these multiple stories. And I think actually that when we talk about the ecological health of where we are, you inevitably have to move beyond these boundaries, you see, because we're talking about our survival. Then ideas of, oh, is it Malay survival or is it Chinese survival? It's just survival. We want to have air to breathe. We don't have air to breathe, we won't be here. So it comes down to a very fundamental, basic, root level. So how are we going to save, save where we are? Because the thing is that when it comes to the environmental crisis, I think that the thing is this, there's a very nice quote that and that's from one of the pieces, from a piece that I've recently been reading about how if we really want to address the issue of climate change in an effective way, we've got to bring it down from the stratosphere. And we have to bring it down to where we are, what can we do where we are? And that would necessarily include different people actually coming together and saying oh, there's flooding in this area, what can we do about it? So I actually think that the environmental crisis that we're facing in specific places, each place is going to have its specific, is going to experience that impact in specific ways. I think addressing it together then is one way of moving beyond this kind of tribalistic thinking of land and place.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much, Dr. Shivani. I think putting in environment really just wakes everyone up, because you wouldn't say, like you said, Malay survival, Chinese survival. So no such things, yes. All right, Dr. Rai, you have a question?
Thank you so much, Dr. Shivani. It was a very interesting presentation. You brought us into it both as an intellectual, as an academician, as a scholar, but also you kind of shared your trade secrets. This is how I approach my writing. So as researchers, as Malaysian literature and English scholars, a lot of us here, it's wonderful to hear that perspective. The last we heard stuff like this was when, we had Kias Maniam talking about it, Lloyd Fernando talking about it, Ki Tuan Chai also. So my question is, I've got two questions. I'm a bit greedy. I've got two questions. Number one is, as a 21st century Malaysian writer, all the labelings that our 20th century Malaysian writer had, the baggages that they had with them as maybe migrant community or even as first generation, who is your implied reader? When you are writing, you talk about research, you're doing a lot of research, which is wonderful, because that means your narrative it has a context, right? It's not written in vacuum, albeit your location is a created one, is a fictional one. So who is your implied reader when you are constructing your narrative? That would be my first question. My second question is, because you mentioned Kias Maniam, you mentioned these other writers who you look up to, and you are also a lecturer of Malaysian literature and English. I had a quick look at your CV as you were presenting. So you've got all this knowledge, right? How do you compare yourself to them? Like, they've done certain things, some things are great, and some things, sometimes it feels as if it's constructed, or Fernando was trying to do too many things. Mariam was seen as doing not enough. Do you know what I mean? That kind of oscillation, right? So how do you compare yourself to them? Thank you so much.
Wow, those are amazing questions and such thoughtful questions as well. Thank you so much. Yeah, with regards to readership, you see, I think I'm going to give probably a very unsatisfying answer, I think, here, because I do write for Malaysians in the sense that I don't I don't often explain a lot of things in the writing so that it's the intended audience will get it. You know, if I'm making references to something very local, for example. But at the same time, I also deeply believe that the most local writings, the ones that really pay attention in as honest and genuine a way as possible to the issues that affect us as whatever, I mean, whether it's your community or this particular island or, you know, then I think they will carry. Like, so I think that they will move beyond the borders of your space, yeah, your nation. Because when I look at, so I also taught world literature, for example, and I often wondered, you know, like what texts get chosen, you know, to be studied as world literature. And often they are texts that are addressing very local issues, you know, in their specific countries, but that also then have that reach. So that combination of the local and the universal. But I think the problem is that if you start to think in terms of like the universal, like I want to reach, you know, all audiences everywhere, then it becomes deeply problematic. So first of all, I would say this. I don't think too much about who is going to read my work while I'm writing. But on a very subconscious level, I would say that certainly the first people I expect to read my works are locals, like meaning they're Malaysians. But at the same time, I am aware that in representing my subject and my characters as deeply and as authentically as possible, that those stories may carry beyond the borders of the country. I don't know if that addresses, I have, you know, this is what I often say, I'll say by midnight, I'll get a better answer for you. Often this is what happens. I'll have the answer that I really wanted to give later. But yeah, that's, I think the commitment I find when I'm writing is to the most local and specific context. And when I do that, then I think it actually does reach. Yeah, it has that reach. So I'm thinking of, you know, like the Russian writers, for example, you know, they focused on their specific, you know, the issues that affected their time, the particular geographical region, the particular community, and then we're reading them, you know, decades later. So yeah, in terms of other writers, okay. So this is a tricky question because I do admire the, you know, right, Lloyd Fernando K.S. Maniam. But there are times when I feel that many of the earlier writers from the earlier generation were too, they had too much of an agenda. Like they began with that idea that I'm going to construct this Malaysian narrative. I want to tell you about how the races can live together. So for example, I find Maniam's Enough Our Country an excellent text to write about academically, but not necessarily an enjoyable, immersive, evocative read as a reader. So it doesn't necessarily make me feel many things that I would expect to feel when I pick up a novel to engage with. So I find that very important. Like for what I produce, I want the reader to not care about national issues in the first instance. I want them to care about it eventually, like as they fall in love with the place that has been evoked and with the characters, with the story itself. So that's my primary point of contact when it comes to writing, which I feel some of these earlier writers didn't approach writing in that way. So that's how I would separate myself in terms of the earlier writers and what I produce today. It doesn't mean that I'm not interested in the same issues. It's just that I think our points of departure are different, like where we begin the process of creating our stories.
That's an excellent answer, Dr. Shivani. You make me feel less bad about not getting some of K.S. Maniam's novels because yes, the novel you mentioned that was the book you mentioned was quite challenging for me.
Yeah.
Dr. Shan has a question and then Ben Ying. All right. So Dr. Shan, you go first.
Okay. Hi, Shivani. Thanks for that. Yeah, it was really riveting listening to you, and we could see that you were you're completely rooted in what you're speaking of. Just to talk about Yalpanam, especially, like when Ed asked me to review it, I thought, yes, I am going to do this because you're one of the very first Malaysian Indian women writing from Malaysia, and I think that's something we need to celebrate because most of the voices come from outside. And you talked about, place-based, identity and place-based. And I think that's also very central to your novel because you talk about the relationship between Maxim and Pushpanayagi. And, because you chose a younger, a young girl and then an older lady, India, and they were both from the marginal communities in a sense, right? And one was pushed to leave, right? Because the parents say, okay, you have to go to Australia because that was when, everybody says this is not working for you, you go. But somehow you managed to, you talked about the visceral, you because that was what I liked very much about your novel because because this morning Raihana had a picture of her with a biscuit, a cookie, butter cookies. And I was telling Jess that's what I liked about yours. It's that notion of the biscuit tins, the biscuit. That's part of Malaysian, identity. And I think this is something that is missing in a lot of, see, people talk about okay, the Indian rice or the whatever, but these biscuits, I think it's sort of so ingrained in all of us, and that's so could you talk, because you talked about the museums, you talked about going and looking at all these, right? So what about this notion of the I'm sorry, I'm just the biscuits, that whole, because that's integral to, I think, Malaysian identity, all households, or at least us. Could you speak a little bit about that idea of the visceral in your writing?
Actually, this goes by my dean, actually, who read the novel. He's from the UK, and he loved the novel for that reason. He didn't mention biscuits, but he said as he was, because he was trying to get to know Malaysia better, and he was reading the novel, and he heard the chit of the lizard. He was like, "But it's actually happening, right? I'm here," and. You see, I think I'll answer this by way of an story of what I attempted to do when I first started writing seriously. So when I came back from Malaysia, I had all these ideas about Malaysian writing because I'd been doing the reading and the research, right? So intellectually, I was very stimulated. And so I had lots of ideas as to what I wanted to do. I wanted to write this great Malaysian novel. And so I started with the concepts, the concepts of how this, these different races come together, and that's place, isn't it? I mean, that's going to really captivate an audience because they're going to know about how multiculturalism works in Malaysia. Of course, it failed. I wrote this basically a very sort of didactic novel that gave you ideas about Malaysia, as and of a particular, because it was set in Subang Jaya, but it didn't give you the real sort of immersion, the sense that you're in this place, because place doesn't just mean, the ideas around it, but it also means like the details. What does it mean to actually inhabit this place, like in the day-to-day, very sort of, ordinary, actually, very ordinary way that we live our lives here. And so I was very, that's the kind of writing I like to read. So when I was writing, I mean, I wasn't like consciously trying to carve out a place or whatever, but it's like, how does this place become a place? The question that I mentioned, during my presentation, right? Because that's always there in my mind, not in a very like overt way, but it's just there, part of the process of writing. How does this place become a place? And it's these these details which may think they're really small, or they're not really significant, or they're trivial, but actually it's all those components that come together to give you a sense that we are here, and this is Malaysian life, right? Without it sounding preachy, like this is how we come together as conceptually. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yes. Thanks, Shivani.
All right. So two final questions, Dr. Shivani. Lots of questions for you, but just two final ones from our PhD students in China. First one, Benying asked, how do you apply literary mapping or cartography in your writing? Maybe some personal tips from you. And then Meng Meng asked, a very brilliant question, I think. Does a person who is of a single descent, like 100% Chinese, say, experience diasporic identity in his own country or community? I think what she means is, yes, like you are of one single descent, you're in the land that you're supposed to be in, can you still experience diasporic identity? All right. So yes, over to you, Dr. Shivani.
Go ahead. Interesting questions. Literary mapping, literary cartography. To be honest with you, I don't really think about it very much while I'm writing. So by this, I understand by literary cartography, I understand it to mean that, this kind of mix of writers and books that feed you and that form you as a writer. So I would say that it's only in the text itself, like once I have written something and I read through it and I see that some of the influences, emerge. And it happens when I read other people's novels as well. When I was reading Preeta Samarasan's Evening is the Whole Day recently, rereading it recently, I was pretty sure that Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte was a big influence on the novel. I haven't asked her about it, but it's just there in a very sort of intangible but also tangible way. So it's very strange. So I'd say that in the process of writing, it's not something that a writer, anyway, I don't consciously do. But I see it's very interesting to review my work and then to see and review the work of other writers and to see what kind of literary cartography, emerges there. And of course, I also reflect a lot on the work that I do and my writing process, which I'm trying to introduce to my students, and they don't like it very much. Why are you making us think too hard about what we're doing? Well, eventually when you do events and you do interviews, people will ask you questions, they'll ask you, your process and what you think about it. So I think afterwards, as a reflective moment, I think then, sure, putting together a sense of your influences it's important to some extent, I think, yeah. I think by this, I understand the question to be about the emotional experience of I think in terms of alienation, non-belonging, feeling disconnected from the land, because those are generally what people within a particular diaspora can feel across the generations. Of course, I think there are differences with first generation, they may be feeling a different, different kind of disconnection, and then further down the line, the disconnection may be more subtle. But in terms of alienation and feeling like you don't quite belong, or that you're not really connected to the spatial and the cultural elements of your context, I think that's the human condition. I actually think that, in many ways, one can feel that way, wherever you are. So I think asking, I would affirm that, yes, I think one can have that diasporic experience without necessarily being a person from the diaspora, but only in terms of those feelings of disconnection and alienation. But definitely those feelings of disconnection and alienation will have specific dimensions depending on which community is experiencing it. So not to sort of just give a blanket kind of, response to that. But yeah, I think that's what the question is asking.
Yes, I think it's exile perhaps would be a better term to describe it. Yes, but thank you so much, Dr. Shivani. Oh my God, I think a lot of us would have questions because place and self, place and identity it is an ongoing thing, even among the PhD students. I think a few of us are doing that. So yes, oh yes, endemic. Yes, Dr. Anita. I was because I was going to ask dislocation, displacement, especially in this globalized world. So yes, so do contact Dr. Shivani if you're interested to know more. I think I'm going to buy your books, Dr. Shivani. Okay, thank you so
Oh, that's
much.
good.
All
Yes,
right.
Harry, Shivani, Harry Pillay is out, right? It's out for us to get, right? Harry Pillay, no relative.
Book is not related to me. You do not to be related.
I was going to ask Dr. Shan, like, are you related to the Henry Pillay? I was like, oh, but is that rude?
That's yeah, it's out. It's available for pre-order. The book will be physically available in hopefully this week or next week.
Okay, great.
And I'll be launching it at the Georgetown Literary Festival. So if anybody's in Penang at the end of this month, please do come along.
Okay, great. Thanks,
Thank you
Shivani.
so much. All
Thank you,
right.
everyone.
Thank you so much. All right. Thank you for the questions, everyone. I'm going to hand over the chairing to Siti and Jeff. Siti and Jeff, are you guys here? All right, Siti.
Yes, I'm here.
I'll hand it over to you.
Thank
I'm going
you.
to start sharing Jianhua's slides. Okay.
Okay, sure. Okay, so hi, I'm Siti Hawa. I'm going to chair this next two presenters. Okay, the first one is Zhao Jianhua and the second one is Su Jianbu. Okay, so we go to Zhao Jianhua first. Okay, a bit of introduction about Zhao. Zhao Jianhua is a second semester PhD student at the Center for Research in Language and Linguistics, FSSK UKM. She works as an assistant professor of School of Foreign Languages, Changhu University. Her works are mainly on the research field of film adaptation and English literature. And she has also just completed a project funded by Ministry of Education. She had also finished another 2 projects funded by Changhu University, and she has published more than 10 theses at all levels of journals in China. So her presentation for today will be Flash Fiction and the Subaltern's Voice, Asian American Narratives of Trauma During COVID-19. So without further ado, I would like to invite Zhao. You have around 15 minutes to present. Please do.
Okay, thank you, Siti, and thank you all the scholars, teachers, and fellow friends. Okay, it's a great honor for me to be here to present a part of my research. Okay, my topic is Flash Fiction and Substance Voice, the Asian American narratives of the trauma during the COVID-19. So next, flip. Okay, COVID-19 is the most serious pandemic in the modern world and most significant worldwide social and cultural ecological crisis since the Second World War. The pandemic has affected every aspect of human life and has a devastating effect on humans' health across gender, race, social status, economic backgrounds, religion, region, country, and culture, etc. And the World Bank report once showed that the COVID-19 has made the world economy suffer the worst recession in 90 years. Meanwhile, the public health crisis, next slide. Meanwhile, the public health crisis has triggered a series of social crises. White supremacy has revived and racist idea has on the rise, especially in the United States. Social tension has deepened the mainstream discrimination towards minorities, especially the Asian American population. The perception about the people of Asian descent as a foreign race have become more visible. And research showed that the Asian Americans have been more negatively affected by the lockdown and the pandemic than any other racial group. The American mainstream media narratives, they politicize the crisis of COVID-19, and the essence of this kind of politicization is to blame others, which is constructed deliberately in order to shift the target of public blame. And these outbreak narratives on the information epidemic not only convey the false information about the disease, but deepen the social pandemic together with the racial, ethnic, and regional discrimination. So it's surely have a profound and long-lasting influence on the literary creation and criticism, including Asian American literature. And next slide. Because of the extreme fear and anxiety suffered during the pandemic, people, on the one hand, are eager to turn to the COVID-19 news of different channels to get factual information to serve their extreme desire for the deeper understanding of the unknown. But on the other hand, people get fascinated by the horror movies and science fictions to search for a sense of security from the extreme dangers. So the pandemic narrative, fiction or nonfiction, despite its various forms, serve the urgent needs of readers and audience during the crisis. So the pandemic narratives appear suddenly. And the Asian pandemic fictions, why we analyze Asian American pandemic fictions? Because fictions provide an imitation illustration of reality, which is to some extent fulfill people's needs for factual information, their real experience during the pandemic. Moreover, this extreme anguish and unknown fear people experience during the pandemic provide a profound material, which Burke assumed as a source of sublime and beauty. And of course, Asian American pandemic fiction can be served as a counteract to the pain and loneliness and fear people, especially Asian American people, suffer during the lockdown and this. And it can serve as a way to against the elite narratives of the whiteness. So lots of pandemic writers, by using the literary mechanics, imitate the harsh reality and then unfamiliarize them into their stories in order to highlight the truth, reflect the passion, and foregrounding the fears. And then I borrowed the Spivak's acceptance concept because according to Spivak, that because the acceptance of a great diversity, and then they seldom have a chance to speak because of their difference. And then, but I think that to some extent, maybe because of the new network media and some new kind of narrative appears, and the more convenient way of communication. So to some extent, the new network media and flash fiction may provide a way for the substance to voice their own experience. The new network media make the production and dissemination of information more convenient, which not only provide very quick channel for ordinary people to express their wishes and fears, but also bring great change to the form of production of literature work and the way of literature dissemination. And flash fiction, particularly, they sometimes name the microfiction, sudden fiction, short fiction, nano tales, etc., refer to a very tiny piece of narrative work, which can be dated back to the Aesop fables in ancient Greece or many Chinese preaching mythologies and fables. And nowadays, flash fiction inheriting the allegoric of the ancient fables and keep up with the development of time and meet the needs of the common people during the pandemic. So someone said that the internet has promoted the rapid rise and popularization of the flash fiction. This kind of flash fiction, or the features of flash fiction, has made this literary genre more accessible through social media platform. So it's sometimes even be referred to as the Twitter fiction or fictions. And next slide. So a lot of Asian American writers try to adopt the flash fiction to express their particular traumas and experience during the pandemic, in spite of a different kind of background and different religions, race, and cultural background. And some of them comments on the features of flash fiction. For example, Chen would say that this kind of genre provide flexibility of literary creation, and for its for this overlap between prose and poetry, fiction and nonfiction. And Zawiyah once suggests that flash fiction can iterate in incorporating fabulous or surreal elements into a rather realistic narration. And then also comments that the Asian American writers or the writers of colors in general thrive in flash fiction correction because they are living in a rather compressed histories. And Lee also comments that this kind of genre allow a lot of Asian American writing be seen easily, which otherwise would be impossible, given how diverse the Asian American is as a demographic population. Next slide. So I borrowed the Spivak's concepts of subalterns. I think that's new media that provide Asian American people a chance to voice their traumas during the pandemic. I will analyze by using 3 flash fictions, which is published in 2020. I choose this one because they are from different backgrounds and also appeared or published in the beginning of the pandemic. So I think it's a spontaneous creation, okay, and dissemination. Okay, next one. And the first one is The Monster, written by Zawiyah. Monster exactly depicts a housewife. Her weird habits developed during the lockdown. During the lockdown, the wife covered the wall of the living room in newsprint. And she decided to draw 1 monster per day because she thinks that he had a nightmare about the terrible monsters. If she drew the monsters on the wall, these monsters will no longer wake her up at night. And then among these very short stories, there are a lot of horrible description of the monsters. They are full of words and roofs. Their slack jaws resting on the thick bubbling necks, and their shining eyes and the lifelike fangs, their wet mouths hanging out open to reveal the forks of their tongue, such as that to show their fear and trauma suffered by their housewife. At the end of the story, the author, by connecting the monsters with the ventilators and flatline of the monitors. Okay, I stare at the scare of their skin and listening to the monsters shapping, yelling, and try to draw out the clicking of the ventilators and the flat lines of the monitors. So by this kind of connection, which indicated disease and death, the metaphorical meaning of the monster referred to the whole of the pandemics revealed. That's the weird habits of the housewife, which indicate the trauma caused by the bad news prevailing around the newspapers and all these communicating channels during the lockdown can be sensed clearly. The next slide. Next, I will choose the A Forgotten Density, which is written by Yahya. In the story, a low-class schoolgirl is described who is inaccessible to the internet and being mocked during the Zoom class, and finally dropped out of school due to the catastrophic collision of poverty and virus. In the story, this poor girl, Lin, primary school girl, had applied for the internet grant, for he didn't have the access to the internet. And later, when the school went online, her email to teacher landed in all students' inbox, for he is not used to the Zoom system. He mixed the reply button to the reply all button. Her inability to operate the online call system and her grammatical incomprehension of email caused her to be ridiculed by all his peers. And her classmates mocked her a lot, like Lin is a weirdo and he didn't even know what reply all was. Does she think this is a Facebook status update? And even one of his classmates refused her request to be friends out of fear that Lin's status as social pariah might be contagious. So the title Forgotten Density refers to the places of forgotten people in cities. The people who live in shanty town, dormitories, or public housing. The dominant discourse in these cities does not count for these forgotten people, just like Lin, who is so forgotten that the school didn't even send the other students a note when she dropped out of school. Okay, and the next slide. Okay, and the last one I would want to analyze is Jefferson Lee's A Day in the Life of a Software Engineer, which described the suffocated feeling of a Korean American engineer under his mask, a tightened mask, due to the California wildfire as well as the pandemic. Moreover, he suffered extreme anguish and regret for his inability to see his dying grandparents back in Korea. He questioned himself painfully why spending 10 hours a day shifting pixels around to raise the revenue for a corporation complicit in genocide. I refer to the file as well as I think the pandemic and also the mainstream discourse. Okay. He even doubts the act of the immigration, why their ancestors endure all this hardship to let these young people suffer under the shade of psychedelics and alcoholism, and even in price of losing their own language, their identities, and their culture. So he said clearly that I should have studied mind mending, I should have studied time travel, I should have studied their face as they say goodbye, refer to the grandparents. And all this inner monologue indicate his pains and remorse. So the Sweaty and Yahya once say that flash fiction, okay, just like the three ones, with their urgent language and with its swift writing path, has unique possibility for writing in the present moment. It provides a chance for the Asian American people from different status, from different background, from different identity, and from different regions, cultural backgrounds, they can have a chance to state their traumas and state their experience during the pandemic. Okay, that's all for my presentation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Zhao. Is there any question for Zhao's presentation? Okay, I have one question for you, Zhao. Okay, if it's okay with you. All right, basically, you're analyzing the use of flash fiction, isn't it? To look at the suffering and trauma of Asian Americans, especially during the pandemics, right? Okay, so what do you think, okay, in your own personal opinion, what do you think is the actual reasons for the stigma and prejudice faced by the Asian Americans in the flash
and I
fiction?
think, if I'm not misunderstanding, what causes prejudice and this discrimination? Okay, and I think that it's a long history. And when first the Asian people, the immigrants to American, and will be seen as the outsiders. Okay, though later this group of people, the community, try to become one of them, but they're still being seen as the outsider. And even during the pandemic, I think that the minorities, and if, for the color people or the Black people's their rights, although they will be discriminated and be wronged and be persecuted, but they've been seen easily, but not Asian American people. But of course, especially during the pandemic, because we know that the virus was first to have been found in Wuhan, China. So people maybe it's assumed that it's a connection between the virus and the Asian people, especially the virus and the Chinese people. Even though there's no connection, but they assume that. So there's such kind of, discrimination become more obvious and deepened, I think.
Okay, all right. Okay, thank you for your response. Is there any question from the audience? All right, if there is no further question, I would like to say thank you to Zhao for your presentation. Maybe we can move on. Okay, welcome. We can move on to the next presenter, Jeffrey Sujanbo. Okay, hi Jeffrey.
Hi, can you hear me?
All right, yes, I can hear you well. All right. So Jeffrey is a second-year PhD student at UKM, and he is currently working on 3 novels for his PhD thesis. Hong Kong writer Liu Yichang, Taipei-born Malaysian Tash All, and Chinese novelist Jiang Rong. Situated within Sinophone Studies, Jeffrey analyzes 3 schools of Chineseness: place-based, national, migratory, and global, by tracking the various paths each entity takes. So the title of Jeffrey's presentation will be Spatio-Temporal Turn, Fluid Self-Positioning of Multi-Layered Chineseness as a Constellation. So without further ado, I would like to invite Jeffrey to begin his presentation. Okay, over to you, Jeffrey.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jeff. Before I'd like to thank my supervisor, Professor Ruzi, and Shan for their general support and guidance throughout my whole studies. Yeah, and also I'm gonna today I'm gonna focus on my conceptual framework actually, and the topic, as you can see from the title, which focus on the fluid self-position of the Chinese needs, right? So why does, can you move on to the next slide? Yeah. Okay. So first, why focus on the manifestation of Chinese needs? Because basically, as you can see from my face, okay, I'm Chinese. So it is related to my identity, right? So second, it is a resilient term. And the tensions of Chinese needs never cease to contest, even in the, as you can see, I don't know if it is COVID, a post-COVID area, okay? I hope, yeah. And as we can see the different Chinese communities register themselves in response to the, COVID-19, yeah. So next slide, okay. No. Oh, yeah. Okay, basically, there are manifested mainly as 3 cohorts named continental nation building, as you can see in mainland China, and place-based discourse, as you can see in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in Malaysian Chinese, and Singapore Chinese, and extra. Okay, and as also the third, called nomadic Chinese. This study is conducted mainly in like American Chinese scholars, for example, like Harvard Eastern Asia Studies Group, sponsored by, lead by the David Wang and Professor Shi. Yeah, and they all propose a neutral ground for compare the, the Chinese literature from different locales. Yeah. And next slide. But sadly, all three kind of cohorts of Chinese needs are trapped into a kind of structured binary opposition between essentialism, like Sinophone studies, and grand narratives disguised in cosmopolitanism or developmental nationalism. Yeah, next slide. Okay, so all fail to capture the topology of Chinese needs as a fluid cultural identity concept in a state of in the constant state of rewriting in line with the situated feeling mixed with the historical baggage. So how to transcend this kind of ontological impasse, and how to amalgamate without leveling. So this study, next slide. Okay. And roughly speaking, this study postulates an experimental praxis for refreshing composite Chinese needs as a constellation through a syncretic approach, as you can see in this diagram. And the whole part of this conceptual framework is to first identify three roads of self-remaking with regard to three geopolitical locales, with regard to their social cultural embeddedness and living experience, and then to find the shared commonality called, which I coined this term called temporal worldliness, by resorting to two theories, like literal axis of diaspora and the contingency of selfhood community. And this theory I will further explain later. Okay, next slide. Okay. Before digging in chunk by chunk, I will clarify the rationales for doing this. So why calling for epistemic leap, and why forming Chinese needs as a constellation, not a kind of umbrella and homogenizing concepts? Actually, the trend of deterritorialization kind of both the flow of culture and human flows, and the social imaginary open a conduit for imagining identity beyond the geopolitical and sort of cultural barriers. And the rise of post-colonial discourse allows for more space, like for me, Baba's third space, right, for self-articulation. And also the concept of time is revolutionary and discursive, and it actually occupied a kind of abstract space for you to retrieve, right? And also the memory is very radioactive and darting back and forth, and can be used as, and both can be used as a tools to disrupt the temporal sequence, which help form a kind of oppositional discourse against a prescribed power for identity representation. So next slide. Yeah, as you can see, these are my literal corpus. Okay, next slide. Okay, first, let's look at the derive and intersection. Yeah, next slide. Okay. Okay, here, derive actually is one of the key terms in psychogeography, was coined by Guy Debord. Is an avant-garde, Carol straw as an urban experiment aiming to and establish a new space for mutual interaction. So this sort of urban straw in Paris is typically a left band bohemianism, where carol roaming is a kind of strategy for fostering the impulse to destabilize the dehumanized socio-economic structure imposed by capitalistic exploitation and evoke the numbed awareness to discover the nexus with the urban landscape they lived. Thus, the cityscape becomes an open artistic laboratory, enabling citizens to create their own situations out of their imagination. And there are two terms that form the basis of Derive. First is industrial painting, and the second is unitary urbanism. Okay, these two kind of practical representations call for a kind of secularization of artistic creation and boosting street art as the ideas of reproduction. And this kind of concept can help examine how Liu Yichang, this author, used the landscape of Hong Kong as a fictionalized space for identity negotiation via parallel narratives. First, as you can see, Chun is a male protagonist in this novel, and his self-remaining is based on his spatial temporal configuration of Hong Kong urban science via his reflection on the situated alienation displacement and his nostalgia back to his old days in Shanghai. And Ah Xing is a local Hong Kong girl, and her self-remaining is based upon her projection of a new persona beyond the social economic fetters of Hong Kong. And Liu's literary trope, like Derive, forms a kind of everyday praxis by capturing Hong Kong from gazes of two ordinary people, right? Unlike flaneur, which is coined by Benjamin, right, which forms a kind of cynical distancing, and this concept form a spatial temporal experiment for restoring the strict self-awareness by urban stroll to form a two-way paradigm of placemaking and discourse reproduction. And Derive also help unpack how Liu fostered a pedestrian speech act to sardonically disclose the fragmentation and commodification of urban space of Hong Kong and redefines the function of public space for collective and individual representation. And also it turns the street into a central matrix for interactive gathering and enables a new metric of secular self-articulation for common inhabitants like Chun and Ah Xing. Okay, next slide. Okay, the next concept and novel is The New Ability and Five-Star Billionaire, written by Tash All. Yeah, next slide. Okay. First, let's look at the definition from the new ability. Actually, this term is proposed by Mimi Scheller and John as a kind of this term is more than a kind of a movement, moving between one location and to another. It's actually a kind of register for ideas circulation, and this has three layers of meaning. First is this pure motion of human capital. And second, it carries a kind of metaphorical representation. For example, like, leaving one country for another is like evading political persecution and to chasing freedom, right? And also social meanings, for example, like daily commuters, like moving from one place to another to fulfill their social roles. And also the most important part in this term is the duality. Yeah, the mobility is a kind of ambiguous and self-paradoxical term. It indicates both the progression and insecurity is in the, how you interpret. For example, like in the industrialization area, yeah, the mobility is kind of a weapon for the workers to, to combat the standard pattern system. And for now, for the postmodern area, mobility means a kind of restlessness. It's a kind of insecurity. Yeah, because yeah, the world is too the world is too fast. The tempo is too fast. Yeah, people are kind of alienated by this kind of lifestyle. Yeah, they feel innerly insecure. Yeah, so let's move to the dash or why I apply this term to no, back to the, yeah, okay, thank you. Let's look at the Tashal. Why I use mobility to analyze, to examine Tashal. Okay, Tashal's novel is actually a transnational crossing for self-remaking. And in this novel, you can see the doubleness. Okay, because it is a story about 5 Malaysian Chinese for self-remaking, and they all went to China. But when they land in Shanghai, yeah, one of the most thriving city in China, the image of ancestral fantasy is not what they had in their mind. China changed a lot, and here doubleness appears. They have to confront the doubleness of new China. And second, moving to a new place, they have to struggle to fit in. But the traces of Malaysia still linger there. To quickly fit into Shanghai, they have to hide their past identity and to make their name as climb the social ladder, and they have to wear the luxury brands for social positions, like, yeah. And the result is everybody is lost in Shanghai's ultra modern. Its glow is complicit with its alienation. At this time, the childhoods of Malaysian, uh, their hometown, especially in the countryside, just flashback, which form a striking contrast. The past they want to brush off comes back as a placeable to soothe their inner disorientation. So it's very weird, right? At the beginning, they come to Shanghai, especially want to do a self-remaking, but then their past become a placeable for them to do self-repair. Yeah, inner self-repair. Yeah. So as you can see here, the identity is split, dangling between Malaysian abandonness and his lived experience in Shanghai. So as you can see in the below, yeah, mobility is actually a self-paradoxical becoming and unbecoming. Yeah. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, let's move to the third novel, Identity Graphing and Jones Wolf Totem. Yeah, next slide. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, the third term is called identity grafting, right? And this term is actually coined by as original horticultural expression, and later Defi Huilin Li further explain this theory and create a kind of a stage theory. And first, it is a born again type. This kind of type happened when a born again type is actually a kind of defense mentality when one first settled in the host culture or host land. For fearing of being rejected, he or she will resort to their original culture. And repressive type happens when you begin to accommodate the host culture, and then you have to hide your own identity in order to quickly fit into the host environment. And integrative type naturally comes as a result of the repressive type, whether willingly or willingly, because you're already in that kind of situation. And the final stage is situational type, means kind of fluid appropriation of identities according to your own embeddedness mixed with the host culture. Okay, so let's see how this type can fit into the Zhang Rong's work. Okay, Zhang Rong's wolf totem is a story about a self-exile as an, and this protagonist named Chen Zhen wants to use his own self-exile as an alternative for his own and national salvation. And first, what he wants to do is to do an internal comparison between the grassland civilization and the central plain civilization. So they use the marginality as a point of departure to criticize the central plain civilization. The second is a cross-cultural dialogue. Here, Chen Zhen used wolf spirits, and the author further explained it as a wolfology, which means for the West, yeah, which represent the West, and the sheep which represent for the peasantry mentality espoused by the Confucius philosophy, right? And also this kind of philosophy influenced the Chinese generation over generation, right? Okay, and the third is through the internal and cross-cultural comparison, the author wants to form alternative discourse to cut off the decayed part of a Chinese needs and injects new elements into it. So this is what I call the identity grafting of how to manage Chinese needs. Okay, so in the end, the identity grafting of Chinese needs is a kind of semiosphere by combining the new elements and its own parts, which can be which can form the basis of their roots. Yeah. Okay. Move on to the next slide. So after sorting out 3 roads, this is a very important question. So how to reconcile to unveil a constellation of Chinese needs? Next slide. Okay. What I want to do is to find a shared commonality in 3 geopolitical locales called temporal worldliness. Temporal worldliness is actually a archetypal oneness that 3 types of Chinese all share. That is, despite different roles each agency adopt to frame their own discourses, they are intrinsically Chinese. It treats Chineseness as a galaxy that encompasses all layers of Chineseness articulation as a polyglot. And the ultimate goal is to formulate a loosely connected site without compromising respective distinctiveness. So here I propose 2 concepts. The first is literal access diaspora, because as you can see, whether you register the Chinese states in the first novel, second novel, third novel, they all talk about a question is about the diaspora, right? For a Hong Kong-based writer, Liu Yichang, he talks about cross-border Chineseness. For the second threshold is called transnational Chineseness. For the third is called the internal diaspora, right? So it's all talk about diaspora, but manifested in different ways. And the second is contingency of selfhood and community. As you can see, this term is actually coined by Roti. What he wants to do is to break the hierarchy of nominal and phenomenal world, which is espoused by the Plato, right? So what he wants to emphasize here is to see the self and the community as a two-way, a dialectical process. Okay, so this is why I want to use this, because in all 3 texts, all the characters, they form their own identity through due process of interaction between the place they reside and their own subjective power, right? As you can see here. So, and also through carving out three roads of self-repositioning through derive the new mobility and the identity grafting, and then calling for epistemic leap for bridging them through shared temporal worldliness, a constellation of Chineseness would be envisioned as a resilient site without, I mean, without a kind of blind conflation. Yeah. Okay. Next slide. Okay. Okay, that's all for what I want to share. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for your presentation. Is there any question for Jeffrey? From Rosie, you have any question?
No, it's just that, for a second year student, Jeff has the complexity of his work, I think is amazing. So, but it takes a while to bring together all those constructs together for him to find answers to his, to fulfill the objectives of his research.
Yeah, actually, I put it into my methodology part, as you know, Professor. Yeah, because time is limited, so cannot.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. And I think now it's my turn to present.
Okay. Yeah. So let me introduce you.
Okay.
Okay. Let me have an introduction of the speaker, Siti Hawa Muhammad. She's a second-year PhD student at the Center for Research in Language and Linguistics, FSSK, UKM. Her PhD project focuses on Muslim Sikh literature, where Siti contends that there is a conflict between conservatism and modernity in Sikh lit, written by Muslim women writers, as this genre has characteristics that are distinct from its Eurocentric equivalents. So the floor is yours, Siti.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. First of all, I would like to thank my supervisors, Dr. Wright and also Prof. Ruzi. And my topic for today will be the third space for minority Muslim women, exploring the possibilities in Muslim Sikh lit. Okay, can you please click on the slides? Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the text that I'm going to talk about, or the analysis that I'm going to talk about, is on Sophia Khan is Not Obliged. This is written by Aisha Malik. She's a British Pakistani writer. Okay, next slide, please. Basically, third space for Muslim women is one of the constructs that I'm going to look at in my conceptual framework of my current study. And for this analysis, I'm going to first of all explore the pertinent issues surrounding Muslim women identity, particularly minority Muslim women. And my second objective is to analyze what constitutes as a third space within the novel, Sophia Khan is Not Obliged, published in 2015, and how does the heroine utilize this space for identity negotiation. Okay, next slide, please. Can you please click? All right, can you please click on the slide? All right, thank you. Okay, all right, can you go back to the previous slide? Sorry, right. Okay, so basically there are 4 issues, okay, surrounding minority Muslim women. Okay, the first issue is Western misconceptions on Muslim women. Muslim women have often been thought as being oppressed because in contemporary neo-Orientalist writings, Muslim women have often been portrayed as oppressed and belittled by Muslim men and subservient to their husbands with no equal rights. And Muslim women, another misconception of the West regarding Muslim women is they are forced to wear headscarves. And actually, hijab is a very personal choice. Islam very clearly and specifically states that there should be no compulsion in religion. Thus, the verse La ikraha fid din. And besides that, another misconception is that Muslim women are not allowed to be educated. When in fact, if we look back at history, the first university in Fes, Morocco, Al-Kawariyin University, is actually started by a woman. It started as a mosque, but later it developed into a university. And another Western misconception is that Muslim women are homogeneous. So what it means is that Muslims are, as a whole, are always thought as being of Arab descent. But in fact, Muslims are not a homogeneous or monolithic group. Rather, though Islam originated in the Arabian Peninsula, only 20% of the world's Muslim population live in the Middle East, while everywhere in the world you can find Muslims. And does that mean Muslim women could literally be any ethnicity? Okay, the second issue surrounding minority Muslim women is the limited self-representations in narratives. The first one is the stereotypical media images. Even in the mainstream print media, pictures of sexual misery that frame Muslim women as downtrodden or exploited can be found. Basu 2022 states that Muslim chick lit novels face challenges of representing Muslims in a cultural context when there are dominant images of religious extremism, violence, and the subjugation of women that overdetermine the representation. Besides that, there's also lack of authentic representation of Muslim women. And Muslim chick lit novels, for example, face challenges of representing Muslims in a cultural context when there are dominant images of religious extremism, violence, and the subjugation of women that overdetermine the representation. Okay, sorry, I think I repeat that point twice. Okay, the next part is, the next issue is culturally enacted Islamic practices. In many societies, Muslims are practicing their own cultures and customs, and women are being subjected to cultural issues, political oppression, and patriarchal features of their society. Okay, although Quran and the tradition of the Prophet emphasize on gender equality, rights, dignity, and status of women, there are people who use it for discriminating against women after tempering some verses to dehumanize them. And I think this mostly has to do with how the Quran are mostly interpreted by men, thus the patriarchal interpretations of the Quran. And the power to explain the religious rules is preserved by men, thus patriarchal importance are reflected and politicized as the religious scholars are mostly men. And the last issue is the balance between two worldviews. Muslim women writers face a challenging politics of reception that attempt to relegate their voices within the limited binaries of East and West, traditional and modern, Islamic and secular. Within these binaries, there is an implicit assumption of an inherent incompatibility that existed between Islam and Western values, especially when it comes to gender equality. So these are the four issues that I look at, and thus, these issues bring me to analyze, okay, the use of third space, especially in the genre of chick lit written by Muslim women writers. Okay, can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, first of all, I'm going to look at the concept of the third space. Okay, Baba examines a formation of hybrid cultural identity. So in this concept, elements of different origins come together and become involved in the process of hybridity. The colonial power attempts to transform the identity of the colonized people, and thus a negotiation of cultural differences produces a new form of cultural identity that is contested and evolved. And the past and present interact to produce a cultural identity in the in-between cultural space. And this third space assumes the negotiation of cultures in ambivalent and contradictory spaces. And the subversion of authority basically takes place through a process of hybridization. And the third space challenges the articulation of culture as a homogenizing, unifying force. Okay, can you change to the next slide? Basically, the third space allow for possibilities of sites of resistance and negotiation. The challenge and possibility of Muslim women usually largely concern gender and religion. So this third space is where they can actually confidently engage in the reinterpretation of the Islamic text and also the reinterpretation of their culture. And in this third space, the Muslim women can reclaim an identity which liberates them from culturally enacted practices of their countries of origin. Because like what I've mentioned just now, Islamic practices that they might have followed are usually culturally enacted. Means it is not pure Islamic teachings, but rather it has been influenced by culture. And the next one is, okay, third space can become a platform, okay, for Muslim women to gain more freedom to negotiate their rights and identity. And it can also become a platform to reinterpret religious teachings in a new light. Okay, so can you please change to the next slide? Okay, so this is my interpretation of the third space for Muslim women. So we have the minority Muslim women's culture and also the Western mainstream society, because I'm talking about the minority Muslim women. So this context zone, the third space is where they can actually, negotiate their identity. It can also, this third space can also produce a form of counter narrative where they can actually deconstruct the Western misrepresentation of Muslim women. And it also becomes some sort of spaces of hope, okay, for Muslim women. Okay, can you go to the next slide? Okay, thank you. All right, so now, this is my analysis. Okay, I'm looking at the third space in Aisha Malik's Sophia Han is Not Obliged. Okay, so a bit of introduction of the text. Okay, Sophia Han is Not Obliged revolves around the life of Sophia, a 30-year-old hijabi, a book publicist and a second-generation British Pakistani Muslim who rejects the idea of living with in-laws after marriage. At the beginning of the novel, she is single once more after breaking up with her boyfriend, who wants them to live with his extended family after the marriage, a practice she sarcastically calls a hole in the wall, referring to the opening or hole in the wall that joins two houses. The novel starts with Sophia lamenting her breakup just before Ramadan and its aftermath in her blog. So she is a publicist and she also has a blog, www.sophiasblog.co.uk, with the title Fight the Good Fight by Yes, I'm Muslim, Please Get Over It. This analysis proposes that the blog constitutes a third space for Sophia to express her actual thoughts about marriage and tradition. In the blog, she laments the non-existent empathy from her aunts and uncles regarding her breakup with Imran. Rather, she had nothing but the question of marriage shoved down her throat. Okay, I'm reading some examples from the text. Quote, okay, an entire month and all my aunties, even the occasional uncle, felt compassion was redundant. For spiritual sustenance, they used their obsession with marriage instead. There was no sympathy at the mention of my no longer marrying the lawyer, and no shock when I explained why the hole in the wall was an impediment to marital bliss. Unquote. Sophia's relatives, being typical older generation, are persistent to the point of being intrusive in pushing her to get married. Quote, Maria is getting married, Sophia. Now it is your turn. Huh? Maria is Sophia's older sister who is going to be married and live with her in-laws. Sophia, on the other hand, finds that every time someone mentions the M word, marriage, they became monochrome to her. like the first half of The Wizard of Oz, signifying that marriage is adventure-like and detached from reality to her. She articulates in her blog her rejection of South Asian traditional practice of living with the in-laws that Imran proposed as something which is not normal. Quote, I tried, I did, but what normal human being would ask another human being to live with a cohort of mother, father, brother, and sister-in-law with 2 children, complete with sister and brother-in-law and 3 children next door, and a hole in the wall joining the 2 houses. Unquote. A deeper reading of the novel shows that Sophia is also not fond of the practice of arranged marriage, where prior to the engagement, there will be a visit by a prospective groom and his family called rishta or proposal. Sophia would make up excuses not to meet her potential spouse in the presence of their families as she reasons. I'd rather not meet someone for the first time as a potential conglomerate, and refuses to sit around and serve chai and samosas to a bunch of muppets. People think that Sophia is a snob, as she sufficiently put them off, and Imran thinks that she is westernized. Sophia's rebellious attitude towards matrimonial traditional practices speaks a lot about her identity as a young British Pakistani woman who subverts the authority of her culture that she thinks does not conform to her personal beliefs. This subversion tacitly appears in the caption of her blog, Fight the Good Fight, implying that she is resisting any matrimonial traditions such as arranged marriage and living with in-laws. Okay, yet the next caption by Yes, I'm Muslim, please get over it, implies that Sophia is affirming her identity as a practicing Muslim and probably wants the members of the Western mainstream society not to be startled by her hijab. The caption is also a form of counter-narrative of writing back to correct the misconceptions of the Western mainstream society towards Muslim women. In the list that she writes, Sophia can prove that wearing a hijab does not make her a social pariah and she will not get sacked as a publicist for being a practicing Muslim. She had been called a terrorist in the train on the way to work, and even her mother and aunts are not supportive of her decision to wear hijab. Her aunts tell her how no girls in Karachi, Pakistan wear hijab and are very modern, while her mother narrates how her friend's daughter who put on a hijab had some gang follow her after work, calling her a paki and telling her to go back home. Sophia, ever the positive person, not one who shies away from threat and discouragement, believe that there are some things that cannot be changed, like her decision to wear hijab. And she made this decision 2 weeks after returning from the mosque, where the imam gave a sermon about their duties as Muslims and told them to pray for the people who had lost their loved ones in New York on 9/11. She does not want to compromise her identity as a practicing Muslim. You can't help what you love, and I think I've at least learned what is and isn't worth compromising. And she did not want to compromise her hijab despite the threat and also the discouragement that she received from her aunt and her mother. In her next blog entry with the caption, blah, blah, black sheep by Yes, I'm Muslim, please get over it, Sophia shares her dislike of talking about otherness. She believes that the concept divides both Muslims and non-Muslims, and its aftermath is unpleasant. Quote, I've never liked talk of otherness. What a breeding ground for division and, quite frankly, stupidity. But unfortunately, just because you don't like a thing doesn't mean you won't feel it. Whether this feeling karate chops you, as it probably will at some stage in your Muslim or non-Muslim life, I don't pretend to have ownership over otherness. Or whether it slowly takes the oxygen from the bubble you realize you lived in. It's the after effects that are the most interesting, unquote. The term black sheep comes from Sophia's discomfort of being judged and perceived differently after she had explained about common Asian practice of living with the in-laws after marriage to her Western colleagues. She was asked to write a Muslim dating book by her colleagues, and actually she did not feel comfortable because of that. And her colleagues are actually ignorant and imbued with the thoughts of how she could have disappointed her parents by being westernized and whether or not she'll be stoned to death for writing such a book. Her boss, Brahms, even suggests all types of things, forced marriages, honor killings, to the horror of Sophia, as no one she ever knew was forced to marry someone. So this is another Western misconception. Nonetheless, Sophia, in her own words, remains as positive as ever, and the blog posting gives spaces of hope that her life as a Muslim woman in a Western society will be better. Quote, if things are thrown off balance, you shouldn't worry about it too much. God will chuck down something on the other side of the scale to even things out, though it may very well be a shaky start, unquote. Okay, can you please turn to the next slide? Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think I'll go straight to the conclusion. Okay, in conclusion, the writings in the blog provides a third space for a minority Muslim women like Sophia to negotiate her identity as a British Pakistani who rejects Asian cultural practice that does not conform to her personal beliefs. And the reading of the text shows that she is outspoken and positive. Okay, yet at the same time, in the blog, she reaffirms her identity as a practicing Muslim whose voices are heard in her blog, who refuses to compromise her faith, her hijab, despite the threat and discouragement that she receives. And Sophia's action in subverting the authority of her culture and the ignorance of her Western colleagues, as well as her insistence in wearing the hijab, is a response against the myth of Muslim women as being oppressed. There are women like Sophia who speaks up, and the blog provides spaces of hope where positivity and hope are abound for minority Muslim women. So I think with that, I end my presentation. Thank you. Right.
Okay, thank you, Sidi.
Okay.
Any question? Yeah,
Right.
question for Sidi. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Rai, Rosie. Okay, I think there is no question, I guess.
Oh, okay.
Rosie, we can't hear you. Are you
Sorry,
talking?
Please
Okay,
unmute
yeah.
yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, I know the answer, but perhaps for the sake of your friends who are also doing their PhDs, how difficult was it to get to where you are now? Because you've you started analyzing your text based on the framework. So how did you get to where you are now?
Okay, I think I follow the advice of Dr. Rai and also you, Prof. I actually test the construct. That's what I did. So that's why when I do this analysis, I just like pick and choose one of the constructs, because I think I've presented to you before, right, that I have several constructs. I mean, it's some sort of integrated approaches. So I decide to, why don't I just take this third space and try to test whether or not it can actually be used to analyze the text. And I think, yeah, maybe somehow it can be, all right, because I found that in this text, there is actually, this character in this Sophia Han is not black. She is, actually outspoken, and not only in real life, but she also, spells it out in her blog, and her blog has like around 5,000 viewers, so followers, I think, and she's very adamant about what she wants and does not want in life. So she has her own mind. So I think this also translated to what she writes on her blog. But like going back to your question, I think I test the construct. So that's how I come to this. So I hope I answer your question. All right.
Thank you, Siti. Yeah.
Okay. So I think that's all. All right. Thank you.
Okay, actually, I have a question. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay. Sure.
I suppose I have a question for you. So I'm very curious about a term in your slide called practicing Muslim young woman.
Practicing
So
Muslim.
yeah. As you voice, as you form your kind of Muslim female voice. So the feminism is a kind it's actually a kind of Western borrowed term. So I just wonder how you reconcile the tension between being Muslim and appropriate feminism. I mean,
How do I appropriate the concern of being Muslim and also feminism?
yeah.
Actually, there is one, can I call it a theory? Islamic, what we call as Islamic feminism. Okay, I didn't really read a lot about that, but from my understanding, based on some of the things I've read about Islamic feminism, is that Islamic feminism, the writers or the proponents of this concept, they read again the two things. Okay, there are two scriptures that we as Muslims refer to. The first one is the Quran, and the second one is the Hadith. Hadith is basically a compilation of the sayings and the deeds of the Prophet. And like what I've mentioned just now, okay, the earlier interpretations of the Quran was done by mostly men. So the men scholars, the ulama, all right, most of them are men. And when I think, in my opinion, when they try to read this Quran and also the Hadith, they read it from their point of view. So what Islamic feminism did is they try to unread the patriarchal reading of the interpretation of the Quran, and rather they put their view, as women, Muslim women, or as Muslim women, to read the Quran, from their perspective. So I think, I hope that answers your question.
Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay.
Okay.
All right. I mean, Prof. Ruzi and also Dr. Wright, because I'm not really well with what I understand. Islamic feminism is like that. I mean, they reread the scripture.
But I think Jambao's question is very pertinent, because it seems as if Islam does not promote empowerment for women. If you think about feminism and you break it down, at the core of feminism is female empowerment.
Yeah.
And Muslims believe that the prophet that came to bring the faith of Islam, he empowered especially the Arabian women at the start when he brought Islam, because at the start, the Arabian Peninsula, the way they treated the girls were very much, as if they were second-class citizens. They were not happy when daughters were born, and some would even bury daughters alive. So one of the first things that the Prophet came and he preached, one of the first things was to elevate the status of women. So one would assume, as if, as an outsider's perspective, you would think that Islam and feminism do not go hand in hand. In fact, it does. But as Hawa has rightly pointed, it's the patriarchal reading of it that later became reality, the patriarchal reading of it that makes it sound as if women are not empowered in Islam. And hence you start to bring in an extra lens, the feminist lens. You know what I mean? So, but that was a very good question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Thank you, Sidi. Okay, let's okay, without further ado, let's move to the next speaker. Okay. Let me introduce the speaker. Okay. Amadou Hafazi Alvi is a PhD scholar at the Center for Research in Language and Linguistics, FSSK UKM. She is multilingual poetess and writer. She is a lecturer of English language and literature at King Khalid University, Saudi Arabia, and her PhD research project focuses on English mystical poetry and poetics. Her research interests include English poetry and poetics, post-colonial literature, English language and literature teaching. Okay. Without further ado, the floor is yours. Yeah, Amadou. Okay.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction.
Okay.
Very good evening to everyone here, and welcome to my presentation, which is based on my extensive PhD thesis, which is dealing basically with the mystical poetry of two Asian poets, the South Asian poet Omar Tarin from Pakistan, and the Southeast Asian poet Ghulam Sarwar Yusuf. And in this regard, I'd like to express my deep, actually, sorrow and sad feelings due to the news I heard I received yesterday regarding the sad demise of Professor Ghulam Sarwar Yusuf in Penang yesterday. So I'd like to request everyone to pray for his soul to be blessed in the highest ranks in paradise. My PhD thesis basically focuses on mystical poetry, and quite different from what my esteemed colleagues has presented so far. This research is different as it deals with the genre of poetry, and number two, the thematic concern is beyond the surface actually realities of this life. It's just basically related to a type of poetry that is mainly related to the self's actually search for unity with the higher truth. The next slide, please. So to introduce my topic, Asia is the world's biggest and most densely inhabited continent, comprising of people from different cultures and beliefs, and the writings in English, the Anglophone literature from Asia have made a great contribution to the world literature, and the most important role is of this these Asian writings being bridging the gap or trying to bridge the gap between Asia and the other world, especially the West. And actually, since its emergence, it has been receiving a lot of attention, recognition, as well as criticism. Pakistan, a South Asian country, and Malaysia, a Southeast Asian country, are among the post-colonial nations in Asia that have been recognized for producing noteworthy plenty of literary works in English. Omar Tarin and Ghulam Sarwar, actually, who are both are the focus of my study, are two unique Asian Anglophone poets who write poetry in a different way. As we see, next slide, please. The landscape of Pakistani and Malaysian literatures in English is replete with themes which are largely related to the writer's personal observations and experiences related to colonialism and post-colonialism. Usually we find these writers talking about the questions of cultural and power clashes, hybridity, diasporic traumas, and nationalism, and other, what we call superficial kind of themes. The research problem, or the reason actually that I've chosen these two poets, is that number one, there is a scarce actually in Asian Anglophone writings that deal with metaphysical, mysterious subjects like mysticism. And number two, there's also a scarce, or there is a lack in the studies that scrutinize and study or try to explore these kinds of writings because of different reasons. So actually mysticism, to introduce mysticism actually to all of you, is regarded as a person's continuous and spontaneous urge and quest to search for or to connect with the higher reality, to God or the higher reality. And in this, of course, this has been regarded as a quite personal and an individual matter. But what actually triggers me to investigate Omar Tarin and Ghulam Sarwar is that both of them are the only Asian poets who usually we of course we know that the what is called in Eastern or Islamic term the Sufi poetry or the Sufism has actually started in Arabia and Persia, and it has been considered as a mark actually of the Eastern cultures. But writing pure, genuine English poetry or poetry in English, usually we've been actually coming across a lot of translated poetry from either the Urdu or the Arabic or the original Persian text into English. But these two poets are almost the only ones, the only Asian poets who genuinely and originally write mystical poetry in English. So next slide, please. The objectives of my study was to explore the mystical themes in selected poems from the poetry of both poets. Actually, these poets have been studied and approached from different, sociocultural, post-colonial, identity-related things that are superficial perspectives. But to investigate and explore mystical themes was a gap actually in the literature review that is found. The literature that is found related to both poets. And number two, to examine the thematic as well as the stylistic similarities in the selected mystical poems. And number three, to determine or to look for the factors that underline these similarities between both of the poets. Next slide, please. Actually, there was a need to find a very actually strong framework to investigate, to prove that both actually poets are mystical in their writings, or mysticism is a basic concern or major concern in their poetry. So after having, after doing extensive actually study for the theoretical frameworks that were and the scholastic works related to mysticism, since its emergence as a separate scholastic field, actually, the mystic way by Underhill has been known as the very actually the prominent and mostly actually acknowledged framework for mysticism. And actually, in brief, to explain this the mystic way theory, Underhill actually has identified 5 stages which are essential for a person to go through in order to reach towards the final unitative life with the higher realities. So it starts with awakening, which is the awareness of the presence of something supernatural in all the surrounding, in whatever actually the poet sees around. And in this stage, actually, we find a kind of intellectuality that goes beyond the normal intellectual level of others, sensing that there is in nature, in the world around, in everything that we have in life, there is a kind of supernatural thing that a person should strive actually, or should struggle or try or do his best effort to reach. And the analysis that we've done in the poetry of both poets has actually shown huge similarities in this stage, as both poets were trying in different settings. That, like Omar Tyne, he started from Pakistan, and Professor Ghulam Sarwar started from Malaysia, and then they used to roam around different places in the world and they have sensed something supernatural, just as Wordsworth and other romantic poets used to sense in nature. So they started with this stage, moving to the other stage, which is purgation. Once this is quite, similar or to the word tazkiyah that we have in Islamic Sufism. In this stage, the soul strips away its ego and the whole existence, and tries to purify itself and cleans up all the worldly stains, so to be able to attain unity with God. And again, both poets have shown this with a lot of striking similarities, that they're in their way to get to the unitative life. They are trying to purify themselves. They're actually facing, or they are actually confessing that their souls needs to be purified. And after that, they reach towards the third stage, which is elimination, which is known as the path of light. And here the heart undergoes after the purgation that already was experienced in the second stage. The heart now is illuminated with the divine knowledge. So there is what's known in Islamic Sufism the ishraq, or the kashf and tajalli, when the person spiritually experience the presence of God, and he can realize, or the person or the soul can realize the presence of God, and the soul is coming nearer and nearer towards the divine, actually union with divine. And in this stage, actually, it is not the noteworthy point about this stage, that and so many people come or reach toward the stage, and then they cannot go further, because it's not easy actually to experience that divine manifestation, and feel that the knowledge of God and realization, the true meaning of existence, and the true reality of the life, of the purpose of life, and the purpose of the soul's existence in this world. Again, here, both Ghulam Server and Omar Tarin were like in verses, clearly they were admitting that whatever we see here is everything is united, everything is in this life is actually it's telling about a reality, and we as human beings should overcome all the hurdles and all the obstacles in this way. After that comes the dark night of the soul, and from its title it looks like, after coming so closer to understanding to the truth or the reality, the soul goes back to the actually life, or the actual world around, and it experiences what actually Underhill actually termed as withdrawal symptoms of God presence. So here there are what the Islamic Sufism mark as khawf, raja, and khawf, which is fear, raja, which is actually hope, or hope for complete union. And there is the contraction as expansion of the soul. It's just like a psychological phase that a person has after going through the previous three stages experiences actually, and the person is in fear of losing all of that and coming back to the dark realities of life. And again, both poets, there are a lot of instances of their poetry where they have experienced or expresses they're actually dangling between the sweet, they call it sweet pain actually. They feel that they're so near to the that final stage of union with God, but at the same time they're afraid that they may lose this actually blessing, what we call blessing. The final stage is unitative life. This is the ultimate stage. Underhill phrases it as the final triumph of the spirit, the flower of mysticism and humanity's top note. In this way, in this stage, the soul lives its highest and most perfect forms as it reaches actually complete consciousness of truth, and fulfills the circle of being, and yields completely to nourish the heights of existence with its direct contact and relation with God. And this unitative life, what marks the poetry of Omar Tarin, the mystical poetry of Omar Tarin and Ghulam Server. We find both poets show having entered in an eternal order to which they magnet the universe, and the whole universe actually seems like dragging every living thing towards God. This notion of actually divine transcendence and universal affinity is associated with all formal mystical practices of all religions. The purpose, the target is the same, but the ways are different. And here we find in the poetry of Omar Tarin and Ghulam Server showing that, for example, like Tarin says, whenever I go in the sacred house from the Hijaz to Hindustan, there's only one word, one creed, one road. This is the road, O voyager, clear vessel on the sea of sand. At the same time, Yusuf says the divergent paths meander through intricate confusions of being, apparently leading up blind alleys, yet the pious journey must go on in a inevitable, etc., etc. So we find that this unitative phase is the last point in the soul's journey to God, where the extremes of sublimity, simplicity, and that actually there is one of important thing that come out of our analysis of the reformation, as the title shows, informing and reforming the concept of mysticism, is that the soul does not only live individually in this stage with God, but it comes back and it starts transferring actually this light of God towards the on a collective actually way towards everyone, and toward it changes the life. This unitative life means living a life for the sake of God and for the sake of humanity. So both poets actually have stressed this point, that reaching or arriving at the last destiny, which is unitative life, does not mean being so actually selfish or living individual, or it's just not a personal, but it's thing or achievement. It should shows it results on a collective level in society and in the people or in the life around. So this our investigation actually of these points or these stages, or the poets have having gone through these stages, indicate remarkable general similarity between both poets, not only on the thematic level, but also on the stylistic level. I'm not going to touch the stylistic level because this article actually focuses on one part of the study, but the study has shown also that the stylistic similarities, number one, it united both poets, and number two, it is very important to show that poetry can deal even with mysterious, ambiguous themes like mysticism. Next slide, please. So the findings of this study, or the major findings of the study, has confirmed or have confirmed Omar Tarin as an original Pakistani mystical poet and insider. I have already introduced that he is a Pakistani poet. He is living in Pakistan, and he is writing mystical or Sufi poetry in English, trying to actually reflect the actual or the genuine mystical culture of Pakistan. And his poetry is actually the investigation, or sorry, the analysis that we have done on his poetry actually tells us how he tries to reflect the Pakistani mystical culture. Actually, the images, the imagery, the references that he used from the Persian and the Urdu poets, for example, or the Punjabi poets, or the Punjabi actually culture, and the romanticizing the nature in Pakistan as a way to unite the soul with God, is remarkable in his poetry. So his poetic conceptions demonstrate his faculty of imagination, his sensibility, and his actually poetic notions that are embedded actually from the Pakistani culture and history. Very often we find him so much absorbed in the delightful Pakistani flora and fauna, with the themes of spiritual evolution and love and beauty and cultural memory and cultural. Also, he talks about the loss of cultural of culture, of the Pakistani culture, and his actually what we call his yearning to revive that mystical culture. The visualization of the Pakistani and South Asian cultures, the rural life especially, it actually shows his patriotic enthusiasm, his passion, his affection with Pakistani mystical culture. On the other hand, Ghulam Server has been, his poetry has been read and as from different, as a normal kind of poetry. But when any person or when we read his mystical poetry, the investigation and the actual analysis of his poetry made us to go deeper and deeper to find why, because he is the first poet in Malaysia who introduced mysticism or Sufism into the Malaysian poetry. Usually we find a lot of Malaysian poets talking about nature and romanticizing nature, and because Malaysia actually is a beautiful natural country, and everyone can be mesmerized about its nature. But Ghulam Sarwar's poetry is different. It actually talks about the beauty, but in another way, as a unifying agent, actually, as a way to unite with God. And going or digging back into his background, we came to know that it is his Pakistani or Punjabi roots that, or his Punjabi or his actually roots in the culture, the Pakistani culture, who has shaped actually his mystical poetry, and the way he does talk about the sorry, um, the Malaysian culture and Malaysian beauty, and he uses the Malaysian culture and landscapes and symbolism also to talk about different Malaysian values, cultures, architectures, and even different, folklores and old Malay, manuscript and literature. But this was his major achievement. He introduced mysticism to Malaysian Anglophone literature, and also he introduced the cosmology, or he integrated this culture with the culture, with the Asian or the Eastern Sufi or mystical culture, and he tried to put strong connections between God, humans, nature as vital source for spiritual actually creation. Next slide, please. So the factors that lie behind the analogy or the similarity between Omar Tari and Ghulam Sarwar are cultural, as we said. Both belong to the Asian mystical culture. Lingual, both poets are the first poets who tried or who wrote mystical poetry in English and not in the Asian or the Pakistani or the Malaysian native languages. And intellectually, both poets possess a high level of self-realization, self-actualization, and self-fulfillment, and that's what they want to try, or they try to assert in their poetry, that mysticism, or this is the reformation that they made in the concept of mysticism. That is, actually, mysticism is not quite personal or individual matter, but it is a kind of a collective consciousness that we as Asians, or we as the sorry, the Pakistani and Malaysian people should express, or should know, that our culture is strong. It's in its devotional poetic traditions, and their poetry outlines our cultural literary inheritance, and these sacred senses of responsibility, community, unity, love, freedom, and humanism. And actually, poetry to the Eastern cultures has been always regarded as not a matter of one territory, or as a personalized or denationalized, but it was, it was not taken from one perspective, just as in the Western perspective, but it is regarded as a multi-dimensional zone, transcending borders and histories and cultures even, and signifying individual sensibility together with the communal sentiment, and voicing a very strong sense of community identity. Next slide, please. The other important thing.
Sorry
sorry.
to interrupt. Yeah, 10 minutes out. So could you please move to the conclusion part? Thank you.
Yes, this is the last thing.
Okay.
This is the last thing. Also, one of the important findings in the research is that both poets have incorporated Eastern and Western mystical intellectualities by, reconciling between mind and soul. Because previously, as we see in the Eastern cultures, mysticism is quite spiritual and personal, while in the West, mysticism is rejected as illogical and a kind of something which goes against the mind. Also, they asserted, as especially in the case of Ghulam Sarwar, sure that Eastern mystical cultures are not, static. They are transmittable, and the way he moved or he's transferred the mystical culture from his roots towards Malaysia is clear and lucid. There is a correlation of also mysticism used to be regarded as a very mysterious and ambiguous topic that cannot be written in words or expressed in words. It's kind of ineffable thing, but the way they write in another language, which is the language of the other, shows that there is a strong relation between poetry and all forms of experience, including the personal and spiritual experiences. Their mystical poetry is oriented towards establishing a room within the national culture, thereby informing and reforming the exact nature of the culture, representing the spiritual identification of the East incorporated with the Western English language and psychology. And also the reformation of the individual performances reveal the capability of mysticism to endorse communal transformations on the collective level towards the communal awakening. So next slide, conclusion. We conclude that this study has put the epistemological approach of knowing the self, human consciousness, and sociocultural integration, and also it promoted sociocultural communication and mutuality, actually. And then it's revived mysticism with reforming its concepts in a way that it can reconcile both Western and Eastern concepts. At the end, Taryn and Yusuf present a mystical poetry in English to revisit, continue, and transform the resisting and progressive spirit of literary cultural heritage and spiritual social imaginary of previously colonized Asian nations. And this is very important to fortify the dignity and sovereignty of the Asian nations in the globalized world. Thank you for listening, and place for questions if you have.
Okay, thank you, Amatu. So, any questions?
Just a comment. Just a small comment.
Okay.
You said that he's the only poet in the writing in English who engages in Sufism, or are you saying that because for Malay writers, Sufism has been, or mysticism has been part of the Malay world since the 16th century in Malay literature, that is. So even there are quite a number of Malay poets who are actually labeled as Sufist poets.
Yes, I have come across actually the same in Pakistan. They write in their native actually languages, but I was talking about the originally writing in English. We can see a lot of translated work from Malay and Urdu languages, Arabic as well, Persian, but so far and after, because I visited lots of places and libraries in both Pakistan and Malaysia and tried to find out if there is anyone writing in English, genuinely in English, which is not easy actually. Even to write about such themes in your native language is not easy. So these two poets, and that's why I tried, I found that it's interesting to compare and to find what kind of poetic genius is behind such writings, and what is the actually common the grounds of this analogous type of writings from same culture, even if it's different in the diasporic, as Ghulam Sarwar is a Pakistani, is outside insider, and Omar Tarn is insider.
Yeah.
So,
but maybe you like to think of whether Ghulam is more influenced by Malay Sufism, because it's been in the Malay world for the last few centuries, or whether he's influenced by the Pakistani.
He is influenced more by the Pakistani, actually, Sufi culture, and that's why there are a lot of striking similarities between him and Omar Tarn, which shows that the trend that he introduced is different. Is different from the Malay Sufism or the conventional Malay Sufism.
But also when you used Underhill, did you look at other, because that would be a Eurocentric perspective of Sufism?
Yes, that's what actually the main finding of the study is that they did not, both poets did not only inform or adhere to the conventional Eastern mysticism, but because they are writing in English, and of course the readership will be in the West, and including the native Western people, and also the Pakistani and Malaysian diaspora in the West also. The English speakers over there. So because the subject of mysticism itself is very difficult, and the West, even if you talk to any Western person or about this, they even refuse to talk about this. They consider it's nonsense or something which is beyond, which is not reality actually, which is not there, and it's just a wastage of time. Or they usually describe the Eastern culture, especially the Pakistani and the Indian cultures, as emotional, as imaginative, as always unrealistic. Yeah. So writing in English is, I think they tried to, even in our investigation or analysis of the thematic and stylistic, we tried to incorporate different Western, concepts of mysticism, including, panentheism and cosmic unity of being, and all these, which are sometimes regarded against the Islamic and the culture and the Eastern cultural, concepts. But the way they try to incorporate, taking them, integrate them in a way that they do not go against the Islamic and Eastern culture, but at the same time, they actually support foster the psychology of mind, and the that the West is actually already believing in. So they tried, and because it was only 15-minute presentation, I couldn't give more details and more examples to show how they incorporated. So the way the mysticism, the concept of mysticism that they put is a new one. It's a reformed one. It can be actually read and understood, and also enjoyed actually by different readers from different. So that's why they tried. Since they are united with God now, they want everything, or all cultures and all people, to be united under this, because in the context of post-colonialism and this clash of powers and the aftermaths of colonialism, we have narratives and counter narratives. Everyone is trying to assert identity in different ways, from different perspectives, socio-cultural, linguistic, other cultures. But taking it from this way, from their self-affirmation, from making a person internally strong, to show his identity, strength, and cultural strength, that is what actually has come out of the study.
Thank you, Amatul. Okay, we've come to an end. Is it Siti or Jeff who's going to call upon, or Ruby?
Yes, I can do it. But then I have to actually leave in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Prof, yeah. Okay.
Could
yes.
you show the last slide?
Yes, can. Let me just flash it out. Where is it? Okay. Slides for each speaker, is it? All right.
Yeah. The last one, the goodbye one.
Okay. All right. Let me just put it up. I'm gonna share my screen right now. Okay. Right, it's coming up. So I'll go to the last one, Doctor.
Yep.
Oh, wait, sorry. Okay. This one, Prof?
Yes, yes. Okay. Can we call upon Dr. Ravi to give the closing, some short closing remarks?
Okay. Can you all hear me?
Yes, yes, Doctor.
Yes, Professor.
Thank you, Prof. Ruzi, and thank you, Ruby. Okay, I'll make this short. Mine is primarily to thank all the parties that lent their support to making this a success. So let me just identify the parties that I'm grateful to for making this a big success. I mean, first of all, I have to thank Prof. Ruzi for undertaking this task this time around and lead the conference, and also for getting the students to be the facilitators. But okay, on behalf of the group, of the research and discourse group, I would like to extend our gratitude to our keynote speaker, distinguished Professor Dr. Shamsul Amri Baharuddin. I always look forward to his talks because there's always something new to take away from each of his keynote sessions. So this time he talked about nation of intent and the 6 investigative modalities. To me, it was new because I've not been keeping in touch with Prof. Shamsul's ongoing work. So this was new to me, and I think it's something to think about and ponder on. Very interesting. Equally engaging were the voices of our guest speakers. I would like to say thank you very much to Ms. Karina Robles Bahrain, Professor Dr. Noor Farida Abdul Manaf, Dr. Shivani Sivagurunathan from Nottingham. So thank you very much actually for making time to come and share your viewpoints on the part as being writers and creative narrators. Also to the third group of people, our scholars and graduate students, for sharing your research with us today. Hopefully this will inspire the audience. We have so many other PhD candidates, many who just newly registered in UKM. I hope this will inspire you to present your work in our future webinars. So there was quite a varied topics, but the pretty much kept to the theme this time, new realities. So that was interesting. And also, finally, I would like to thank the chair of our center, Associate Professor Dr. Noor Fariza, for her continued support. And really, I hope this group of graduate students who have been helping us run our conferences over the years, Ruby and your team, please keep doing so. We have more webinars coming up. Okay, hopefully there'll come a time when we can do this face-to-face. Okay, I really look forward to that day. So far, we've been managing with webinars ever since the pandemic started, but I think it'll be very soon before everybody starts coming to campus. It won't be long, I think probably next year onwards, and then we can all probably have the next Zawiyah Yahya webinar series, the 4th one, face-to-face, maybe, or hybrid. Okay, something to think about. Well, that's all I have to say. So we'll see you again at the next Zawiyah Yahya webinar. Next year, we'll keep you posted on that. And if there's anybody who'd like to say something, go ahead. Okay, so that's from me on behalf of the group. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ravi. Okay, everyone. I think we have reached the end, Prof. Ruzi. Yes, everyone, please clap. 8 hours of webinaring. Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to stop recording.